Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights and settle in for a story that isn't about the shiny, heroic myths you sometimes hear, but about the absolutely brutal, grinding reality of ancient Greek warfare. Forget the sculpted heroes and epic poems for a moment. We're going to dive into what it actually felt like to be a regular citizen soldier, picked up from your farm or your workshop, and shoved onto a muddy plain to face an enemy you might never have seen before. This wasn't professional soldiery as we know it. It was a terrifying, often agonizing part of life. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't have survived it. The odds were just that stacked against you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, if you're up for it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine yourself in a small farming village, maybe tending to your olive trees or working clay at your potter's wheel. You're not a professional soldier. You're a farmer, a craftsman, a citizen of your polis. Life is hard, but it's your life. Then, word comes. It's a decree from the assembly, a call to arms. Your city is at war. Your neighbors, your friends, your family members, all able-bodied men, are now suddenly soldiers. There's no escaping it. This isn't a choice. It's a civic duty, deeply ingrained in the fabric of ancient Greek society. You have to arm yourself, usually at your own expense, and report for duty. Your gear is heavy, cumbersome, and expensive. You are a hoplite, the quintessential Greek warrior, named for your large, round shield, the hoplon. This isn't a piece of light equipment, it's a behemoth. Imagine carrying a dish satellite on your arm, made of wood, covered in bronze, weighing perhaps 15 to 20 pounds. You strap it to your left arm, your forearm through a central grip porpax, and your hand through a leather strap anti-lave near the rim. This shield is your primary defense, protecting your left side and, crucially, the right side of the man to your left. This interlocked protection is the genius of the phalanx, the tightly packed formation that defined Greek land warfare. Beyond the shield, you have your primary weapon, a long thrusting spear, the dory. This isn't a throwing javelin. It's designed for punching holes through enemy armor. It's about 7 to 9 feet long, topped with an iron or bronze spearhead, and often has a bronze butt spike sorotor at the other end. This butt spike isn't just for balance. It can be used to finish off fallen enemies or to stand the spear upright in the ground. Imagine trying to wield a broomstick with a knife on the end, only much heavier and more unwieldy, in a packed crowd. And then, there's your secondary weapon, a short sword, usually a cyphus double-edged or a kopis single-edged, curved. This is your last resort, pulled out only when your spear breaks or the lines become too close for spear work. Finally, your armor. This varies greatly depending on your wealth, but ideally, you'd have a bronze cuirass breastplate, often anatomically molded, or a linen linothorax, layers of linen glued together, surprisingly strong and lighter. You also have a helmet, typically a Corinthian or later Chalcidian style, which offers excellent protection but severely limits your vision and hearing. And then greaves to protect your shins. All of this weighs you down, probably another 30-40 pounds. So, you're carrying around 50-60 pounds of gear in the hot Mediterranean sun, marching for days, sometimes weeks, across rugged terrain. It's exhausting just thinking about it. One common historical fact is that the total weight of a hoplite's gear was roughly comparable to that of a modern infantry soldier's full combat load. The march to battle is an ordeal in itself. You're walking with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of other men, kicking up dust, relying on what little food you've packed or what your city can scrape together. Discipline isn't always perfect. These aren't professional armies in the modern sense. There are moments of quiet apprehension, nervous chatter, and the ever-present grumbling about the heat, the dust, and the fear of what's to come. You're surrounded by the sounds of creaking leather, clanking bronze, and the rhythmic thump of marching feet. There's no grand parade, it's a forced march towards an uncertain fate. You try to focus on the small details, the feel of the earth under your sandals, the weight of your shield, anything to keep your mind from dwelling on the dread building in your stomach. When you finally reach the battlefield, it's often a relatively flat plain chosen for its suitability for phalanx combat. The two armies array themselves, typically facing each other across a few hundred yards. This is the tension before the storm. You stand in your ranks, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, maybe 8 to 12 men deep, forming a solid wall of bronze and wood. The air crackles with anticipation. You can see the enemy line, a shimmering mass of bronze in the distance, slowly growing clearer as they advance. You hear the distant shouts, the war cries, the pipes playing a martial rhythm, maybe even the occasional taunt from the opposing side. Your mouth is dry, your heart pounds a frantic rhythm against your ribs. Imagine the smell dust, sweat, fear, and the metallic tang of bronze. You can feel the nervous energy of the men around you, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. Some are chanting, some are silent, some are quietly praying to the gods. You adjust your grip on your spear, feeling the rough wood, the cold metal tip. You check the fit of your helmet, the narrow eye slit severely restricting your peripheral vision. You can barely hear anything beyond the man directly to your left and right. This deliberate restriction of sensory input, particularly sight and hearing, contributes to the feeling of being an isolated cog in a much larger, terrifying machine. It's almost like trying to fight in a tunnel, focused only on what's directly in front of you. This pre-battle tension could last for hours. Sometimes negotiations would occur, or the armies would simply stare each other down, waiting for a sign, an omen, or a strategic advantage. It's a game of nerves, each side trying to intimidate the other. You might hear the priests leading sacrifices, hoping for favorable omens, for the gods to smile upon your cause. This religious aspect isn't just for show. It's a deeply held belief that the gods directly influence the outcome of battle. A bad omen could shatter morale and even lead to an army retreating without a fight. This reliance on divination might seem absurd to us now, but for them, it was utterly real. As the lines finally begin to advance, the relative silence is broken by the rhythmic pipes and trumpets, the sound of your own army's marching cadences. This music isn't for entertainment. It's for keeping the phalanx in formation, ensuring every man moves in lockstep. The ground begins to tremble under the thousands of marching feet. You lean into your shield, pressing against the man to your right, feeling his body heat and the presence of the collective. This tight formation is both your greatest strength and your greatest vulnerability. If the line breaks, chaos ensues, and you become a lone, exposed target. One dark joke from the time might be a veteran hoplite muttering, "The only thing more terrifying than facing the enemy is the thought of tripping and falling in our own ranks." Because once you're down, it's very hard to get back up. You are not fighting as an individual. You are a part of a wall, a living, breathing, bronze-tipped wall. Your courage isn't about personal glory, it's about holding your place, pushing forward, and trusting the men beside you. The true brutality of this phase isn't just the impending violence, but the mental strain. The sheer terror of knowing you are about to collide with another mass of armed men, head-on, with no escape. The moment of impact is unlike anything you've ever imagined. It's not a graceful clash of individual heroes, it's a brutal, chaotic shove. As your phalanx closes the final distance, the rhythmic advance gives way to a final desperate surge. You are pushing, leaning into your shield, feeling the weight of the men behind you, an irresistible force driving you forward. The sound is deafening, the guttural roar of thousands of men, the clatter of bronze against bronze. the splintering of wood as spears snap, and the sickening thud of bodies colliding. Your limited vision through the helmet's eye slits makes the world a terrifying tunnel, focused only on the shield in front of you and the enemy's spear point glinting in the sun. You meet the opposing phalanx with a jarring jolt that reverberates through your entire body. It's a literal pushing match. A wrestling scrum where the strongest, most disciplined line will eventually break through. You are locked in, your shield protecting the man to your left, his shield protecting your right. You're not fighting to cut down dozens of foes. You're fighting to hold your ground, to push, to maintain the integrity of the line. Your spear, held overarm or underarm depending on your preference and the available space, becomes a jabbing, thrusting instrument, seeking any gap in the enemy's shield wall, any exposed flesh. You hear the screams of men, the desperate gasps for air, the terrifying gurgle of blood. The space between the two phalanxes is known as the othismos, the pushing. This is where the true brutality lies. It's a claustrophobic hell, a meat grinder where men are crushed, trampled, and impaled. Imagine being in the middle of a massive, violent scrum, unable to move freely, constantly jostled, pushed, and lunged at. You are relying entirely on the men beside you, on their strength, their courage, their ability to hold their ground. If one man falters, if a shield wall opens even slightly, the entire line is vulnerable. You hear your comrades shouting encouragement, curses, and terrified cries. Your own voice is hoarse from yelling, from fear. Your primary weapon, the dory spear, is incredibly effective in this tight formation. You thrust it forward, aiming for the gaps between the enemy's greaves or above their shields at their throats or faces. The spear's long reach gives you an advantage, allowing you to strike before the enemy can get too close with their swords. However, spears break, and they break often. The impact of bronze on bronze, the force of a powerful thrust against bone, will snap the wooden shaft. When your spear splinters, you immediately drop it and draw your short sword, your cyphus or kopis. This transition to sword fighting is even more terrifying. The combat becomes much more personal, a desperate, close-quarters struggle. You are now face-to-face with the enemy, no longer relying on the protective reach of your spear. The limited space means you can't swing wildly. Every movement must be precise and efficient. You aim for vulnerable spots, the groin, the neck, the armpits, areas not fully protected by bronze armor. It's a frantic, exhausting struggle. Every swing, every thrust, every block demanding immense physical effort. Blood splashes onto your shield, onto your armor. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, iron, and fear. It's truly a nightmare come to life. One common historical detail that is often overlooked is the role of panic in ancient battles. While the hoplite phalanx was designed for cohesion and discipline, individual fear could spread like wildfire. A single man breaking ranks, a sudden shout of "Pan!" could trigger a rout. And once a phalanx broke, it was a massacre. The retreating soldiers, encumbered by their heavy armor, were easily cut down by the pursuing enemy. The real danger wasn't always during the initial clash, but during the rout, when desperate men would throw away their heavy, expensive shields just to escape. This is why the saying, "Return with your shield," or on it, was so important. Abandoning your shield was the ultimate disgrace, a sign of cowardice that put your entire city at risk. The noise is constant, a terrifying symphony of death. The clash of metal, the shouts of war, the screams of the dying, the rhythmic chanting of the commanders trying to maintain order. Your ears ring. Your head throbs inside your heavy bronze helmet, which, while protecting you, also makes it incredibly hard to hear commands or gauge the wider battle. You are isolated in your own small, brutal world within the phalanx, focused solely on the sliver of enemy in front of you. Fatigue sets in quickly. The sheer physical exertion of pushing, thrusting, and blocking while carrying 50-60 pounds of gear is immense. Your muscles scream, your breath comes in ragged gasps, and your mouth is bone dry. Yet, you cannot rest. To falter is to die, and to endanger the lives of your comrades. You push through the pain, drawing on reserves of adrenaline and sheer terror. This is the difference between a disciplined phalanx and a broken one, the ability to endure the agony and keep pushing forward. A curious, lesser-known detail of hoplite combat is the phenomenon of drift. As the phalanx advanced, there was a natural tendency for men to unconsciously shift to the right, leaning on the shield of the man next to them for protection. This meant that battles often ended with the right flank of each army outflanking the left flank of the enemy, and the entire battle line slowly rotating in a clockwise direction. Imagine trying to keep a perfectly straight line when thousands of men are instinctively drifting. It added another layer of chaos to an already frantic situation, and often led to confusing maneuvers as commanders tried to correct the alignment. This is an ongoing debate among military historians. How significant was this drift? And how did ancient commanders account for it? When the enemy line finally wavers, it's a moment of desperate exhilaration. They begin to break, to turn, to run. This is when the true slaughter begins. The disciplined fighting gives way to a chase, a frantic pursuit of fleeing men. You drop your heavy shield, grab your sword, and run after them, driven by the instinct to kill, to secure victory, and perhaps to take spoils. The pursuit could be just as dangerous as the initial clash, as desperate men would turn and fight, or fall and be trampled. There's a grim joke among veterans that the real danger isn't the guy in front of you. It's the guy behind you who wants your enemy's shield. After the rout, the battlefield is a horrifying spectacle. Bodies litter the ground, some still twitching, others already still. The air is filled with the groans of the wounded, the cries for help, and the triumphant shouts of the victorious. You move through the carnage, perhaps searching for fallen comrades, perhaps scavenging for abandoned armor or weapons. The stench of blood and human waste is overwhelming. This isn't the glorious aftermath depicted in art. It's a brutal, messy reality. You've survived the brutal clash, the terrifying othismos. And now, as you catch your breath amidst the carnage, your attention shifts to the very tools that define your existence as a hoplite. Your gear isn't just equipment. It's your life, your identity, and your entire fighting doctrine wrapped up in bronze, wood, and linen. Understanding these surprisingly simple, yet deadly instruments is key to grasping the essence of ancient Greek warfare. Let's start again with the hoplon, your massive shield. You still feel its immense weight on your left arm, even after the battle. It's not just a defensive tool, it's a weapon. Made primarily of wood, often poplar, and faced with a thin layer of bronze or leather. It's about 3 feet in diameter. The bronze rim isn't just for decoration. It's a reinforced edge that you use to bash and shove the enemy in the tight confines of the phalanx. Remember how you leaned into it, pushing with all your might. That was the othismos, the literal pushing match, and the hoplon was your battering ram. The ingenious double grip system, the central porpax and the anti-lab strap, allowed you to hold it firmly. Yet it still made your left arm scream with exhaustion. This shield protected about half of your body, but crucially, it also protected the right side of the man to your left. This interlocking shield wall was the secret to the phalanx's strength, a literal wall of bronze. Next, your dory, the spear. If your first one snapped, you'd grab another, or resort to your sword. This wasn't a javelin you'd throw from a distance. This was a thrusting weapon, typically 7 to 9 feet long. Its length meant you could strike the enemy before they could reach you with their shorter swords. The iron or bronze spearhead, often leaf-shaped, was designed to pierce armor and flesh with deadly efficiency. And don't forget the soritor, that butt spike on the other end. It's not just for standing the spear upright, it's a secondary weapon. used to dispatch fallen enemies, or even for close quarters fighting if your primary spearhead was stuck or broken. Imagine driving that sharpened bronze tip into someone's chest. It's a truly brutal implement. Historians often debate the exact grip and thrusting style of the dory in close quarters. Was it always overarm? Or could it be underarm in the crush of battle? When your spear inevitably broke, you reached for your sword. The most common was the cephas, a straight, double-edged blade, usually about 2 feet long. It was designed for thrusting and slashing in close combat. If you were a bit wealthier, or preferred a different style, you might have carried a kopis, a curved, single-edged chopping sword, similar to a machete. This was less about elegant fencing and more about brutal, hacking blows in the tight confines. Your sword was your last resort, pulled when the lines collapsed, or when you were fighting for your life in a chaotic melee. It was a terrifying moment when the spear line dissolved and the fighting became personal, a grim dance of steel and blood. A veteran hoplite once quipped, "A hoplite's spear is his wife, his sword, a fleeting mistress." Because if you're using your sword, things have gone very, very wrong. Your helmet was another critical piece of gear. The iconic Corinthian helmet, made of bronze, covered your entire head and face, with only narrow slits for your eyes and mouth. While offering superb protection, it severely limited your vision and hearing. You were essentially fighting in a bronze tunnel, isolated in your own terrifying world. Later, more open styles like the Chalcidian or Illyrian helmets became popular, offering better visibility and hearing, a small mercy in the deafening chaos of battle. Regardless of style, a good helmet could mean the difference between life and death, deflecting blows that would otherwise shatter your skull. Imagine the reverberation inside your helmet as a heavy blow connects, a ringing that could leave you disoriented. Even if the blow didn't pierce, beneath the helmet, you wore your cuirass, your body armor. This was either a rigid bronze breastplate, often molded to the contours of a muscular chest, which, let's be honest, you'd earned, or a more flexible linothorax. The linothorax was surprisingly effective, made from layers of linen glued and pressed together, sometimes reinforced with bronze scales. It was lighter than bronze and offered decent protection against slashing blows, though a direct spear thrust could still penetrate. Greaves, bronze shin guards, protected your lower legs, and sometimes arm guards were worn. All of this armor, while life-saving, added immense weight and restricted your movement, contributing to the sheer exhaustion of combat. The overall impact of this equipment, especially when combined with the close-packed formation, was to create an incredibly formidable, yet also incredibly rigid, fighting force. You weren't nimble or agile, you were a walking tank, designed for a head-on collision. The beauty and the brutality of hoplite warfare lay in this simplicity: push forward. Hold the line. Thrust your spear. There was little room for individual heroics or elaborate tactics once the lines engaged. It was a test of sheer will, discipline, and physical endurance. This uniformity of equipment and tactic is a key reason why hoplite battles were often relatively short, but incredibly decisive. A battle of brute force. One interesting and often debated detail about hoplite equipment is the weight and mobility during the summer months. Ancient Greek summers are brutally hot, and fighting in full bronze armor could lead to rapid dehydration and heat stroke. How did they manage to endure hours of marching and combat in such oppressive conditions? Were battles deliberately short? Did they fight only at dawn or dusk? Historians still actively discuss the physiological limits of hoplite combat in the Mediterranean climate. Perhaps they just got used to it, in the same way you adapted to the constant hunger or the freezing nights in your training. The logistics of arming such an army were also considerable. As a citizen soldier, you were typically expected to provide your own gear. This meant that only citizens with a certain level of wealth, those who could afford the bronze armor and weapons, could serve as hoplites. Poorer citizens might serve as light-armed skirmishers or archers, if their city employed them. This economic barrier to full hoplite status meant that the fighting force was often a reflection of the city's middle and upper classes, giving them a significant stake in the outcome of the war. It's a pragmatic system, ensuring that those fighting the hardest also had the most to lose. So, when you see depictions of ancient Greek warriors, remember the weight of that hoplon, the balance of the dory, the bite of the xiphus. Remember the sweat, the dust, the ringing in your ears inside your bronze helmet. These weren't just props. They were the intimate, brutal tools of survival, defining every terrifying moment of your life on the ancient battlefield. They transformed a farmer or a potter into a disciplined, unyielding fighting machine, ready to be hurled into the chaotic push of the phalanx. Before the terrifying clash, before the first spear thrust, came the strange and often eerie rituals, superstitions, and psychological preparations that defined ancient Greek warfare. You might be a hardened hoplite, but you're also a deeply superstitious man, living in a world where the gods held immense sway over your fate. The moments leading up to battle weren't just about lining up. They were about seeking divine favor, interpreting omens, and steeling your nerves for the slaughter to come. Imagine the dawn of battle day. You wake not to the sound of trumpets, but to the murmuring of priests and the bleating of sacrificial animals. The first order of business for your commanders is almost always to conduct sacrifices to the gods. An ox, a goat, or a sheep might be led to an improvised altar, its throat slit, and its entrails examined by a diviner, or mantes. They're looking for favorable omens, a healthy liver, specific patterns in the smoke rising from the burning offerings. A good omen would send a ripple of confidence through the ranks. A bad one, however, could cause widespread panic, even leading to a decision to postpone or avoid battle entirely. You stand there, your helmet heavy in your hand, watching, hoping, praying for a sign that the gods are on your side. This wasn't just ceremonial. For the Greeks, it was a vital, pragmatic step, as real as sharpening your spear. As the morning progresses and the enemy lines become clearer, another form of psychological warfare begins. The war cries and taunts from across the battlefield. You might hear the enemy phalanx letting out a guttural roar, a collective bellow designed to intimidate and unnerve your own officers, or perhaps the Lacedaemonians if you're fighting alongside Spartans, might lead your phalanx in a coordinated paean, a solemn, rhythmic chant to Apollo, the god of light and order. This isn't just about sound, it's about unity, about instilling courage in your own ranks and fear in the enemy's. Imagine thousands of voices rising as one, a chilling harmony that promises death. The paean also served a practical purpose. It helped regulate the pace of the advance, keeping the phalanx in tight formation. One fascinating, lesser-known detail is the role of music. While not all Greek cities used it, the Spartans, as you might recall, famously marched to the tune of flutes and pipes. This wasn't for entertainment or to make the march more pleasant. It was solely to maintain discipline and a steady, measured advance. Imagine the low, haunting melody of the pipes cutting through the morning air, keeping your steps synchronized, ensuring that the phalanx remained a solid, unbroken wall as it moved towards the enemy. It's a surreal, almost hypnotic experience, marching towards your death to the sound of a simple flute. This musical discipline further highlights the Spartan obsession with order and control, even in the chaos of impending battle. Before the final charge, there might be a period of speeches and exhortations. Your general, mounted or standing prominently, might address the troops. These weren't necessarily long, eloquent speeches like those recorded by later historians. They were often short, punchy calls to courage, reminding you of your city's honor, your ancestors' glory, and the shame of cowardice. You'd hear promises of glory and victory and an honorable death if fate decreed it otherwise. These words, though brief, were designed to ignite the fire in your belly, to turn your fear into righteous anger, to make you remember what you were fighting for. Then there's the psychological impact of seeing the enemy. As the distance closes, individual figures emerge from the mass. You can make out their helmets, their shields, the glint of their spear tips. You try to gauge their numbers, their discipline. Are they resolute? Do they look as tired and terrified as you feel? This visual assessment, often mixed with your own anxiety, is a critical part of the pre-battle experience. You try to project strength, knowing they are doing the same. It's a staring contest before the actual clash. The placement of commanders was also a crucial part of these preparations. Generals and high-ranking officers would typically position themselves on the far right flank of the phalanx. This was historically the place of honor and perceived safety, as the shield of the man to your left protected your exposed right side. However, this also meant the right flank was often the strongest part of the line, providing a solid anchor for the rest of the formation and leading to the phenomenon of phalanx drift, where the entire line would tend to move right during the advance. It's a curious tactical decision, placing your most valuable assets on a flank that naturally wanted to move away from the center. This is a point of ongoing academic debate: was the right flank truly safer? Or did commanders position themselves there for visibility and command, accepting the inherent risk? Finally, there's the personal preparation. You check your shield straps, tighten your helmet, adjust your greaves. You take deep, ragged breaths, trying to calm your racing heart. You might whisper a prayer, or think of your family, your farm, the life you might be leaving behind. You grip your spear, feeling its familiar weight, and brace yourself. The silence, broken only by the rhythmic pipes or the distant war cries, is deafening. It's a moment of profound personal reflection, a final reckoning with your own mortality. Before you are subsumed by the collective fury of the charge, this is the moment when all the training, all the discipline, all the fear culminates in a single, terrifying act of will. You are not just a citizen. You are a weapon, primed and ready to be unleashed. The moment arrives. Your general gives the command, and the great mass of your phalanx begins its final charge. It's not a headlong sprint, not a wild dash. It's a disciplined, accelerating walk, then a jog, then a final, thunderous push. The ground trembles beneath thousands of pounding feet, a rhythmic, terrifying drumbeat signaling inevitable collision. You lean into your hoplon, pressing against the man to your right, feeling his sweat, hearing his ragged breath. Your world shrinks to the bronze shield in front of you and the looming, shimmering wall of the enemy. The air is thick with the scent of dust, fear, and the metallic tang of bronze, the rhythmic cadence of the flutes. If you're a Spartan, or the shouts and chants of your comrades, fills your ears. It's a primal, deafening roar, a sound that promises violence and chaos. You can feel the sheer momentum of the thousands of men behind you, an unstoppable force pushing you forward. Your heart pounds, a frantic drum against your ribs. Your mouth is dry, your throat tight with anticipation and terror. There's no turning back. The final few yards are the most agonizing. You see the enemy's faces now, contorted with their own fear and grim determination. You see the gleam of their spear tips, the slight tremor in their lines. And then, with a jarring, bone-shattering thud, the two walls of humanity collide. This is the impact, the core of hoplite warfare. It's not a graceful dance, it's a brutal, chaotic shove, a violent wrestling match on a scale you can barely comprehend. You're immediately plunged into the claustrophobia of the othismos, the pushing. You're packed so tightly, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, that free movement is impossible. Your spear, held firmly, becomes a jabbing, thrusting instrument. You aim for the vulnerable spots, the exposed shins below the greaves, the neck, the armpit, any gap in the enemy's shield wall. The sound of bronze scraping against bronze, the splintering of wood as spears snap, the guttural grunts of men exerting every ounce of their strength. It's a terrifying symphony of destruction. You feel the weight of men pressing from behind, pushing you forward, forcing you into the melee, unable to retreat even if you wanted to. Your dory is your first line of attack. You thrust it forward, aiming to pierce, to wound, to kill. But spears are fragile. They break against shields, snap against bone, get stuck in bodies. When your spear splinters, which it inevitably will, you drop it without a second thought. There's no time to mourn its loss. You immediately draw your short sword, your xiphos or kopis. The fight becomes even more personal. A desperate, close-quarters struggle. You slash, you thrust, you hack. The limited space means your movements are short, efficient, deadly. You're aiming for the unprotected areas of the enemy: the face, the groin, the exposed limbs. Blood, warm and slick, splashes onto your shield, your armor, your hands. The ground underfoot quickly becomes treacherous. Bodies pile up, creating obstacles. Men trip and fall, only to be trampled under the relentless forward push of their own comrades or impaled by enemy spears. The sheer physical exertion is immense. Your muscles scream with fatigue. Your lungs burn for air. The heavy bronze armor, designed to protect you, now feels like a crushing weight, a suffocating shell. Yet, you cannot falter. To hesitate, to show weakness, is to invite death. You push through the pain, fueled by adrenaline and the sheer terror of falling, of being separated from the protective wall of your phalanx. One surprising, yet common, aspect of this brutal clash is the psychological impact of the helmet. While it offers vital protection, the narrow eye slits severely limit your peripheral vision. You are literally fighting in a tunnel, seeing only a small sliver of the chaos directly in front of you. Your hearing is also muffled, making it incredibly difficult to hear commands or understand the larger flow of the battle. This sensory deprivation intensifies the claustrophobia and the feeling of isolation. Even as you're surrounded by thousands of men, you rely on the subtle pressure of the man to your right, the occasional roar from your officers, and the primal instinct to survive. It's a disorienting, terrifying experience that few modern soldiers could truly comprehend. Imagine a man falling beside you, his shield clattering to the ground, leaving a sudden, terrifying gap in the line. Your instinct is to fill it immediately, to close ranks, to maintain the integrity of the wall. Your life depends on it, and so does the life of the man to your left. This collective cohesion, this absolute reliance on your comrades, is the true strength of the phalanx. It's not about individual heroes, it's about the unwavering discipline of the group. This constant demand for unwavering group cohesion also highlights an often debated point among historians: how much individual training and skill truly mattered in the chaotic push of the othismos versus sheer numbers and collective discipline. The battle is often short but incredibly violent. Unlike later forms of warfare, hoplite battles typically lasted only a few hours, ending when one side's phalanx finally broke and fled. The moment one side gives way, the entire formation can collapse in an instant. The orderly push turns into a desperate rout, and once the enemy turns their backs, the real slaughter begins. The heavily armored hoplites, exhausted and encumbered, become easy targets for pursuit. You might drop your heavy hoplon and your sword, joining the chase, driven by the desire to secure victory and prevent the enemy from reforming. The battlefield after the clash is a horrifying tableau. Bodies litter the ground in tangled piles, some still groaning, others chillingly silent. The air hangs heavy with the stench of blood, sweat, and human waste. You might move through the carnage, searching for your fallen comrades, offering a last prayer, or perhaps, in the grim reality of ancient war, stripping the armor and weapons from the dead. It's a brutal process, a necessary evil, as this panoply represents valuable resources for your city and replacements for lost gear. There's a morbid efficiency to it. A grim joke might be overheard. Well, at least someone's getting a new tunic today. This is the brutal truth of ancient Greek warfare. No glory, just grit. No elegant duels, just desperate pushes. No clean kills, just messy, agonizing death in a claustrophobic wall of flesh and bronze. You have faced it, you have endured it, and if you are among the survivors, you will carry the scars, both visible and invisible, of the Othismos for the rest of your days. While the hoplite phalanx, that formidable wall of shields and spears, dominated the battlefield, it wasn't the only component of an ancient Greek army. You might have been a heavy infantryman, locked in the brutal Othismos, but there were other warriors, less celebrated, often poorer, who played crucial roles on the flanks and in the skirmishes leading up to the main clash. These are the skirmishers and the rare cavalry, the unsung heroes and the occasional game-changers who operated beyond the rigid confines of the phalanx. Imagine yourself on the fringes of the battle line, perhaps a young man from a less wealthy family who couldn't afford the expensive hoplite panoply. You wouldn't be in the main phalanx. Instead, you'd be a siloi, a light-armed skirmisher. Your gear is minimal, maybe a simple tunic, sandals, and a small, round shield pelta made of wood or wicker, much lighter than a hoplon. Your weapons are varied javelins akon, slings svenden, or bows toxin. You're not meant for direct combat. Your role is to harass the enemy, to disrupt their formation, and to protect the flanks of your main hoplite line. The life of a skirmisher is one of constant movement and vulnerability. You're operating in the open, darting forward to unleash a volley of projectiles, then swiftly retreating before the enemy hoplites can close the distance. Imagine throwing a javelin, feeling the sting of the rope from your ankle, a leather thong that increased throwing power on your fingers, watching it arc towards the enemy line, hoping to hit an exposed limb or cause a momentary ripple of panic. Or perhaps you're a slinger, twirling your sling above your head, launching a lead bullet that can hit with surprising force, capable of cracking bone even through a helmet. The sound of a sling bullet whizzing past your ear is a terrifying thing, a prelude to a sickening impact. These skirmishes often took place before the main phalanx engaged. Your job as a siloi was to soften up the enemy, to wear them down, to injure and demoralize them, making the hoplite clash easier for your comrades. It's a dangerous game of cat and mouse, constantly assessing the distance, the enemy's movements, and the cover available. You're lighter, faster, but utterly exposed if the heavy infantry decides to press forward. This constant risk, combined with the often lower social status, meant that skirmishers rarely received the same glory as the hoplites, despite their vital role. A well-known historical example of the devastating effectiveness of skirmishers against hoplites came during the Peloponnesian War, at the Battle of Sphacteria, 425 BCE. Athenian light-armed troops, specifically slingers and archers, continuously harassed a trapped force of Spartan hoplites on an island, pelting them with projectiles from a distance. The Spartans, accustomed to close-quarters phalanx combat, were unable to effectively engage the mobile Athenians. This battle was a shocking demonstration of how light infantry, when used effectively, could defeat even the legendary Spartan hoplites, highlighting the limitations of relying solely on heavy infantry. It's a point that historians often debate: was this a fluke, or a sign that the nature of warfare was slowly starting to change, moving beyond the rigid phalanx? Then there's the incredibly rare, often ineffective, but sometimes crucial element cavalry. Unlike later periods, ancient Greece was not a land of vast plains suitable for large cavalry charges. The mountainous terrain and the cost of maintaining horses meant that cavalry forces were generally small, often aristocratic, and usually confined to scouting, harassing retreating enemies, or protecting flanks. As a hoplite, you might rarely see cavalry in a direct charge. Instead, you'd see them skirmishing on the wings, attempting to outflank the enemy phalanx, or chasing down routing foes after the main battle was decided. Imagine the thundering hooves, the glint of bronze on a rider's helmet, the dust kicked up by a small squadron of horsemen. They aren't heavily armored like later knights. They often wear light tunics, perhaps a helmet and small shield. Their weapons are typically javelins or spears designed for throwing, and sometimes swords for close combat if they got bogged down. Their primary value is speed and mobility, allowing them to rapidly strike and retreat, or to exploit gaps that opened in the enemy lines. However, the hoplite phalanx was a formidable obstacle for cavalry. A well-disciplined line of spears could easily impale charging horses, and the dense formation offered little room for cavalry to maneuver effectively. A funny anecdote might be a hoplite muttering about cavalry. "They're good for chasing chickens, not for fighting real men." The composition of these light-armed forces often reflected the wealth and geography of the city-state. Cities like Athens, with a larger population and access to varied terrain, might employ more archers or slingers. Thessaly, a region with expansive plains, was one of the few Greek states known for its more substantial cavalry forces. This diversity meant that ancient Greek battles weren't always just two phalanxes slamming into each other. They were often complex engagements involving different troop types, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. The relationship between these different troop types was also vital. As a hoplite, you depended on your skirmishers to soften the enemy before you engaged, and to protect your flanks from enemy light troops. You also relied on the cavalry, if your side had any, to prevent the enemy from outflanking your vulnerable wings. When the battle turned into a rout, it was often the light-armed troops and cavalry who inflicted the most casualties on the fleeing enemy, as they were unencumbered by heavy armor and could pursue with greater speed. The real killing fields often happened after the main event was over. So, while the image of the hoplite is iconic, remember that the ancient Greek battlefield was a more diverse and nuanced place than often portrayed. It was a chaotic mix of heavy infantry, darting skirmishers, and the occasional thundering hooves of cavalry, all playing their part in the brutal dance of ancient warfare. Their contributions, though less glamorous, were absolutely vital to victory, and their stories, while less celebrated, are just as much a part of the brutal truth of ancient Greek combat. You've marched for days, fought for hours, and survived the brutal clash. But the reality of ancient Greek warfare wasn't just about the moments of combat. It was profoundly shaped by something far less glamorous, yet absolutely critical logistics. The challenge of feeding, watering, and equipping an ancient army, moving thousands of men and their gear across often hostile and rugged terrain, was a monumental undertaking that could, and often did, decide the outcome of campaigns long before a single spear was thrust. Imagine yourself, not on the battlefield, but on the march. You're part of a column of perhaps thousands of men, stretching for miles, kicking up dust in the hot Mediterranean sun. Each man carries his own panoply, that heavy shield, spear, sword, and armor. But beyond that, he also carries his own rations, or at least a portion of them. Ancient Greek armies typically weren't supplied by a centralized, organized quartermaster corps like modern armies. Instead, they relied heavily on the individual soldier carrying his own provisions, or on foraging from the land. This meant your pack was heavy not just with weapons, but with dried figs, olives, cheese, perhaps some hardtack bread, and a wineskin. These provisions would last you for only a few days, maybe a week at most. After that, your army would have to stop and live off the land. This often involved pillaging and plundering the countryside through which you marched, whether it was enemy territory or even the land of reluctant allies. Imagine the tension as you approach a village, unsure if you'll be greeted by open arms or hostile resistance. Knowing that your survival depends on taking their crops and livestock, this act of living off the land, while necessary, caused immense suffering to civilian populations and often generated deep resentment. Water was an even more immediate and critical logistical challenge than food. Thousands of men, horses if you had cavalry, and even camp followers needed water daily, especially during the scorching Greek summers. Armies had to constantly be near reliable water sources, rivers, springs, wells, This often dictated the routes of march, the location of encampments, and even the timing of battles. Imagine the desperation if your army got cut off from water, the thirst becoming an agonizing torment, weakening men long before they ever saw the enemy. This need for water could severely restrict strategic options, making seemingly obvious routes impossible. It's a common historical fact that many ancient campaigns were decided not by heroic battles, but by armies being outmaneuvered and cut off from their water supply. Transportation was rudimentary. There were no motorized vehicles, no vast networks of paved roads designed for rapid military movement. Everything moved on foot, or by slow, cumbersome ox carts. This meant that the speed of an army was dictated by its slowest element, usually the baggage train. Imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of moving thousands of men, their heavy gear, and any supplies across mountainous terrain, narrow passes, and unpaved tracks. It was a slow, arduous process, prone to delays and ambushes, a humorous, yet grim joke might be overheard from a marching hoplite. My greatest fear isn't the enemy's spear, it's losing a sandal miles from camp. Because replacing something so simple could become an insurmountable problem. Disease was another constant, often underestimated. Logistical nightmare. Ancient encampments, with thousands of men crowded together in unsanitary conditions, were breeding grounds for disease. Dysentery, typhoid, and other illnesses could decimate an army far more effectively than enemy spears. Lack of clean water, poor sanitation, and limited medical knowledge meant that a significant portion of casualties in ancient campaigns were due to sickness, not combat. Imagine the low moans from the sick tent at night, the fear of waking up with a fever, knowing that without proper care, you might simply waste away. This constant threat of illness was a silent, insidious enemy that marched alongside every army. Communication and command over such large, spread-out forces were also incredibly difficult. Generals relied on messengers, signals like fires at night or flags by day, and the simple ability to shout commands across the din of battle. This meant that strategic maneuvers were slow to execute, and tactical flexibility was limited. Once battle was joined, a general's control over his phalanx was minimal. He could only hope that the discipline ingrained through training would hold. This led to a very rigid, less adaptable form of warfare compared to what would come centuries later. Historians still debate the true level of control generals had over their armies once battle commenced. Was it a true command structure? Or more akin to directing a massive, slow-moving tide? The terrain itself was a major logistical factor. Greece is a mountainous country, crisscrossed by narrow passes and valleys. This limited the size of armies that could effectively maneuver and often dictated where battles could be fought. The iconic hoplite phalanx, while formidable on flat ground, was vulnerable in broken terrain, in forests, or in narrow defiles where its cohesion could be disrupted. Commanders had to carefully select their routes and battlegrounds, always mindful of the logistical support their army would need. This constraint on movement and battle choice had a profound impact on ancient strategy. Finally, the sheer cost of maintaining an army was immense. While individual hoplites provided their own gear, the state still had to pay for supplies, transport, and the eventual wages or bounties for the soldiers, though Greek citizen soldiers often received little direct pay. Their service was part of their civic duty. Naval campaigns, particularly the maintenance of triremes, were even more astronomically expensive, requiring a vast treasury. This economic burden often limited the duration and ambition of campaigns, forcing cities to seek decisive battles quickly rather than endure prolonged wars of attrition. This economic reality often meant that diplomacy and politics were just as vital as military prowess in securing victory. So, while the clash of bronze shields and the thrust of spears might be the most dramatic images of ancient Greek warfare, remember the unglamorous, yet absolutely vital, role of logistics. The constant struggle for food, water, and health. The slow march across unforgiving terrain. The limitations of communication and supply. These were the unseen battles fought every day, often determining whether an army even reached the battlefield, let alone achieved victory. You've imagined yourself on the battlefield, pushing in the phalanx, and struggling with the logistics of the march. But what happens when the enemy refuses to meet you in open battle? Or when their cities are too strong to simply march into? That's when you enter the grim, often protracted, and particularly cruel world of siege warfare. This wasn't about glorious charges. It was about starvation, disease, desperate ingenuity, and immense suffering for both besieger and besieged. Imagine your army, after a long march, arriving at the walls of an enemy city. Unlike an open battle, there's no immediate clash of hoplites. Instead, there's a slow, grinding process of investment. Your first task is to circumvallate the city to build a wall around it, cutting it off from any outside supply or relief. This is backbreaking labor, not glorious combat. You're digging trenches, hauling stones, and felling trees, all under the watchful eyes of enemy archers and slingers on the walls, who might occasionally send down a volley of arrows or stones, reminding you of their presence. This circumvallation might be rudimentary or elaborate, depending on the terrain and the resources available, but its purpose is always the same: to starve the enemy into submission. Starvation and thirst become the primary weapons of siege warfare. You, as a besieger, try to deny the enemy all access to food and water. This means cutting off rivers, diverting springs, or poisoning wells, though this was generally frowned upon and could backfire. Inside the city, the besieged quickly begin to ration their dwindling supplies. Imagine the slow, agonizing descent into hunger, watching your rations shrink day by day, seeing your comrades grow thinner, their eyes hollow with desperation. The cries of hungry children would echo through the city, a constant torment. For the besiegers, it was a test of patience. For the besieged, a test of endurance against the most primal of human needs. While starvation was the ultimate goal, ancient Greeks also employed siege engines, though they were generally less sophisticated than those of later Roman or Hellenistic periods. You might see attempts to build siege towers, massive wooden structures, often on wheels, taller than the city walls, from which your archers and javelin throwers could fire down on the defenders, or from which assault parties could attempt to breach the ramparts. Imagine the immense effort required to build such a tower from scratch, often hundreds of men laboring under enemy fire, knowing that a single fire arrow could turn your colossal effort into a flaming ruin. Battering rams were another common tool. These were heavy wooden beams, often reinforced with an iron head, swung by dozens of men to smash repeatedly against a gate or a weak point in the wall. The rhythmic thud of the ram against stone could be heard for miles, a psychological torment for the defenders, a relentless reminder of the inevitable breach. But defenders weren't idle. They'd drop heavy stones, pour boiling oil or water, or even attempt to swing giant grappling hooks to try and disable or burn the ram. It's a dirty, dangerous business, both for those swinging the ram and those defending against it. One fascinating, often overlooked aspect of siege warfare was the sapping and mining operations. Sometimes, instead of attacking the walls from above, your engineers would try to undermine them from below. You'd dig tunnels beneath the enemy walls, propping them up with wooden supports. Then, once the tunnel was complete and reached beneath the target section of the wall, you'd set fire to the supports, causing the tunnel to collapse and the wall above it to crumble. Imagine the terrifying realization for defenders inside the city when they suddenly felt the ground trembling, knowing that at any moment, a section of their vital defense could collapse beneath them. This was a particularly dangerous job for the besiegers, as tunnels could collapse prematurely or be met by enemy countermines. Historians still debate the effectiveness and frequency of large-scale mining operations in the archaic and classical Greek periods. Often considering it a tactic requiring significant engineering skill, the conditions during the siege were horrific for everyone involved. For the besiegers, sanitation was poor, disease was rampant, and morale could plummet during long, unproductive waits. For the besieged, trapped within their walls, the situation was even worse. Water sources could be contaminated, food supplies exhausted, and the air filled with the stench of sickness and death. Disease often killed more people during a siege than direct combat. Desperation could lead to cannibalism, as recorded in some historical accounts, a grim testament to the lengths people would go to survive. Psychological warfare was also a major component. Besiegers would parade captured citizens outside the walls, torture prisoners, or display the heads of fallen defenders to break the morale of the besieged. Inside, the defenders would try to project an image of strength and defiance, even as their people starved. They might throw their last remaining food over the walls to show they had plenty, or raise their dead in mocking displays to suggest more soldiers were still alive. It was a brutal battle of wills, fought as much with grim determination as with weapons. Finally, the storming of the city. If all else failed, or if a breach was made, the besiegers would launch a full-scale assault. This was the moment of ultimate horror. You'd be scrambling over collapsed walls, scaling ladders, or pushing through breaches, facing a desperate, cornered enemy who knew that capture often meant death or enslavement. The fighting inside a breached city was often the most brutal of all, a chaotic, house-to-house struggle where no quarter was given. Civilians, including women and children, were often caught in the crossfire, or worse, subjected to the horrific realities of ancient conquest, massacre, rape, and enslavement. There's a particularly dark joke from ancient times. The only thing worse than being besieged is being the one who breaks the first wall, because that guy usually didn't live to tell the tale. Siege warfare was a testament to the grim realities of ancient conflict. It was a slow, agonizing process, demanding patience, resilience, and a willingness to inflict immense suffering. It demonstrated that victory was not always found in the glorious clash of phalanxes, but often in the protracted, unseen battles against hunger, thirst, disease, and despair. You've survived the brutal charge, the desperate push, and perhaps even the prolonged agony of a siege. But the battle, whether won or lost, is far from the end of the story. The immediate aftermath of ancient Greek warfare was a grim and often chaotic reality, fraught with horrors for both the victorious and the vanquished, extending far beyond the actual fighting. This wasn't a clean, organized affair. It was messy, brutal, and deeply unsettling. For the victorious army, the first order of business after a rout was often the pursuit of the fleeing enemy. As a hoplite, you might shed your heavy hoplon to run faster, your sword drawn, driven by adrenaline and the desire to inflict maximum casualties. This phase was often deadlier than the initial clash. As heavily armored, exhausted men were cut down from behind with little chance to defend themselves. Imagine the gasping breaths, the terrified screams, the desperate attempts to throw off armor and escape. The ground would be littered not just with the dead, but with discarded shields, helmets, and breastplates, incredibly valuable items that had been abandoned in the frantic dash for survival. After the immediate pursuit, the victorious side would typically erect a trophy on the battlefield. This wasn't a gleaming statue, but a simple monument made from the captured armor and weapons of the defeated enemy, hung on a tree trunk or wooden pole. It served as a symbolic claim of victory, a sacred offering to the gods, and a stark reminder of the vanquished's humiliation. You'd stand there, perhaps exhausted, maybe wounded, watching your comrades assemble this grim monument. The silence of the battlefield now broken only by the groans of the dying and the somber rituals of victory. Then came the grim task of collecting the dead. Each side would typically send heralds under a truce to retrieve their fallen. For the victors, this meant burying their own comrades with solemnity and honor, often on the battlefield itself, or carrying them back to their city for a more formal burial in a common grave. For the defeated, it was a humiliating plea for the right to collect their dead, a clear admission of their defeat. Imagine searching through the piles of bodies, recognizing faces you knew, perhaps a neighbor, a friend, or even a relative. The sight of severed limbs, crushed skulls, and disemboweled bodies would be a common, sickening tableau. The stench of blood, sweat, and bodily fluids would cling to the air, making your stomach churn even hours after the fighting stopped. One common, yet often overlooked horror of the aftermath was the suffering of the wounded. There was no organized medical corps as we understand it. Wounded soldiers might receive rudimentary first aid from their comrades, perhaps a bandage, a splint, but serious injuries often meant agonizing pain, infection, and slow death. Imagine a spear wound to the abdomen or a shattered limb. Without proper care, gangrene and sepsis would quickly set in. Many would die days, or even weeks, after the battle from their injuries or from diseases contracted in the unsanitary conditions of the camp. A dark joke among veterans might be, better a swift death than a slow one in the camp infirmary, because the infirmary was often just a muddy ditch. For the vanquished, the aftermath was often a nightmare. If they hadn't fled, they were often taken prisoner. And for ancient Greek warfare, being a prisoner was a dire fate. While some might be ransomed, particularly if they were wealthy or influential citizens, many faced enslavement. Imagine being stripped of your armor, your freedom, and your dignity, chained and marched away to be sold as property. For the poor, it was a certainty. For the wealthy, it was a terrifying prospect. This wasn't a theoretical threat. It was a common outcome. A stark reminder of the absolute stakes of ancient conflict. Pillage and plunder were also significant aspects of the aftermath. The victorious army would strip the dead of their valuable armor and weapons, not just from the enemy, but sometimes even from their own fallen if they were in desperate need. Camps would be ransacked. And if a city had been captured, it would be thoroughly looted. This wasn't just about greed. It was a way for soldiers to get paid for their service and for the city to recoup some of the costs of the war. But it was also a brutal free-for-all, where violence and opportunistic cruelty often ran unchecked. The fate of non-combatants in the aftermath of a captured city was particularly horrifying. Women and children were often subjected to massacre, rape, and enslavement. Historical accounts, even from ancient Greek writers, describe scenes of unspeakable brutality during the sacking of cities. Imagine the terror of civilians trapped within walls that had been breached, facing the unrestrained fury of a victorious army. This was the dark underbelly of ancient warfare, a side rarely glorified in the epic poems, but a grim reality for countless innocent lives. Historians still grapple with the extent and frequency of these atrocities, but their occurrence is undeniable and stands as a stark reminder of the savagery that lay beneath the veneer of military glory. Even for the victors, the aftermath brought its own psychological toll. The sights, sounds, and smells of the battlefield would linger. The trauma of close-quarters combat, the loss of comrades, the acts of brutality witnessed or committed, these experiences would leave indelible scars. There was no modern concept of PTSD, no psychological counseling. You were simply expected to return home, pick up your farming tools, and reintegrate into civilian life, carrying the silent burdens of what you had endured. Finally, the long journey home. You would march back, often still exhausted, carrying whatever meager spoils you had acquired, leaving behind the fields of dead and the screams of the wounded. The return to your city might be met with triumphant celebrations, but for you, the individual soldier, the glory would always be tinged with the memory of the horrors you had witnessed and inflicted. The brutal truths of ancient Greek warfare were not confined to the battlefield. They permeated every aspect of life, from the initial call to arms to the lingering echoes in the minds of those who survived. You've marched through dust, pushed in the phalanx, endured the horrors of siege warfare, and navigated the grim aftermath of battle. Now, let's shift our gaze from the land to the tumultuous, often unforgiving, realm of the sea. Ancient Greek warfare wasn't confined to dry ground. The control of the seas was often paramount, dictating trade, supply lines, and the very survival of city-states. And here, the iconic vessel was the trireme, a marvel of ancient engineering, and a brutal, chaotic platform for combat. Imagine yourself as an Athenian citizen, not a farmer or a potter, but a rower, a thetes. This is often the poorest class of citizens, but in Athens, serving in the navy as a trireme rower was a vital civic duty and a source of pride. You might not have the expensive hoplon or bronze armor, but your strength, endurance, and coordination are essential for your city's power. You descend into the cramped, dark bowels of the trireme, finding your place on a wooden bench, one of 170 oarsmen packed into 3 banks. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and damp wood. The trireme itself is a long, slender, and incredibly fast warship, designed for speed and maneuverability rather than brute force. It's propelled by the synchronized power of its rowers, and its primary weapon is a formidable bronze-clad ram at the prow. This ram isn't for boarding. It's designed to smash into the enemy ship's hull, ideally below the waterline, to sink it. Imagine the roar of the keels. The rowers chant as your trireme surges forward, aiming to punch a hole in an enemy vessel. The ship shudders violently as the ram connects, sending a sickening jolt through your body, followed by the sound of splintering wood and gushing water. Life as a trireme rower is incredibly arduous. You spend hours, sometimes days, at sea, under the scorching sun or in chilling winds. Your muscles ache from the relentless rhythm of rowing, your hands blistered and raw. Food and water are rationed, and sanitation is almost non-existent. Disease can spread quickly through the cramped, unhygienic conditions. And unlike a hoplite who might face battle relatively infrequently, a trireme rower is always on alert, always ready for the immediate and terrifying chaos of naval combat. Naval battles are a whirlwind of speed, precision, and sudden destruction. The objective isn't a head-on collision like the phalanx, but rather to use your ship's speed to execute complex maneuvers. The most common tactic is ramming you aim for the enemy's side, using your bronze ram to punch through their hull. But there's also the dikplaus, where you row through the enemy line, snapping off their oars as you pass, leaving them dead in the water, or the periplus, where you try to outflank the enemy, circling around to hit their vulnerable stern or sides. All of this requires incredible skill and synchronization from the rowers, who must respond instantly to the rhythmic calls of the kaloustes, the rowing master, and the commands of the trierarch, the ship's captain, usually a wealthy citizen funding the ship. Imagine the noise during a naval engagement, the rhythmic splash of thousands of oars, the shouts of commanders, the piercing sound of trumpets, the crash of ram against hull, and the terrified screams of men as ships splinter and sink. The sea itself becomes a chaotic battleground, filled with debris, floating bodies, and struggling swimmers. If your ship is rammed, you have mere moments to escape before it takes on water and capsizes. You're plunged into the sea, perhaps still wearing what little armor you have, desperately trying to swim amidst the flotsam and the flailing limbs of dying men. Drowning is a common, terrifying fate. One lesser-known but incredibly important aspect of trireme warfare was the training and coordination of the rowers. It took immense skill to row a trireme effectively, especially to achieve the speeds and precise maneuvers needed for combat. Athenian triremes were particularly renowned for their speed and agility, largely due to the rigorous training of their citizen rowers. Imagine practicing for hours on end, hundreds of men moving as one, their oars slicing through the water in perfect unison, until the ship felt like an extension of their collective will. This required a level of discipline and teamwork that rivaled, and perhaps even surpassed, that of the hoplite phalanx. Historians still debate the exact seating arrangement of the rowers and how they managed such incredible synchronization in the cramped conditions. Beyond ramming, boarding actions were also common, especially if a ship was crippled or immobilized. You'd see heavily armed marines, or epibatai, leaping from your deck onto the enemy's, engaging in fierce hand-to-hand combat. This was essentially a hoplite battle on a slippery, unstable wooden platform. Imagine trying to fight with your Sisyphus on a deck pitching wildly. surrounded by the chaos of a sinking ship and desperate enemies. It was a terrifying, brutal melee, where the rules of land combat suddenly applied to a whole new, liquid environment. The stakes in naval warfare were incredibly high. The loss of a fleet could mean the economic collapse of a city-state, the starvation of its population, or even its ultimate conquest. Think of the Athenian reliance on the Piraeus, their port, and their vast fleet for grain imports. Losing control of the sea meant starvation for Athens. This is why figures like Themistocles, the Athenian statesman who championed the building of their massive trireme fleet, were so crucial to their city's survival. A light joke might be a veteran rower muttering, "The only thing worse than a long march is a long row in a flat calm, knowing the enemy is just over the horizon." Even the weather played a brutal role. A sudden storm could scatter or destroy an entire fleet, regardless of the enemy. The open sea was a wild, unpredictable force, adding another layer of terror to naval campaigns. You were not just fighting other men, you were fighting the elements. The vast, indifferent ocean that could swallow you whole in an instant. The aftermath of a naval battle was distinct from land warfare. There were no trophies of armor on a tree. Instead, the sea would be littered with wreckage, floating bodies, and the desperate cries of survivors clinging to bits of wood. You might spend hours after the battle rescuing your comrades, or collecting any valuable salvage. The scale of loss could be immense, with hundreds, even thousands, of men drowning. The sea held its secrets, and many bodies would never be recovered, lost to the depths. So, while the image of the hoplite remains central to ancient Greek warfare, remember the equally brutal and terrifying reality of combat at sea. The cramped conditions, the relentless physical exertion of rowing, the dizzying speed of maneuvers, and the explosive impact of the ram, all combined to create a unique and often more deadly form of warfare. It was a testament to human ingenuity and endurance, a world where the power of oars, the precision of a ram, and the chaos of the waves determined the fate of empires.